Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Richard Arjun Kaul, and welcome to 9. Today's date is August 7th, 2015, and I'm talking to you from New York City, New York. Now, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of stories in the American media about what's referred to here as the opiate crisis, which is the alleged overprescribing of synthetic painkillers such as Oxycontin and Percocet to patients with chronic pain syndromes. Now, there have been a number of high-profile fatalities and overdoses, and the target of the regulatory agencies has been the doctors and the medical profession. Now, I've talked before about how the profession or the medical profession seems to always be on the receiving end of these kinds of issues. And this is a perfect example of how doctors, in my opinion, are being disproportionately targeted. These medications are manufactured by large pharmaceutical companies that have thousands of sales reps that aggressively market these products to doctors. And this has been going on since the early to mid-90s, and it started in 1993 with after a key paper came out of Memorial Sloan Kettering talking about the use of synthetic opiates in non-malignant chronic pain conditions. I've said before, and I'll say it again, the focus of the investigation, the targets of the investigation, and the prosecutions should, in my opinion, be directed towards the pharmaceutical companies. If the pharmaceutical companies are stopped from manufacturing and or promoting these medications, the issue of opiate abuse will naturally be minimized or reduced. Now, as with a lot of issues that I have opinions about, I wrote an article a number of years ago, and it's entitled "The Winter of Our Narcotic Discontent." The ever-increasing complexity of the US healthcare system is reflected in the voluminous barrage of state regulations severely curtailing the dispensation of synthetic opiates to patients with chronic pain syndromes. These recent legislative moves are a response to a relatively small number of deaths related to the overdose of members of the upper echelons of society and a few high-profile celebrities. However, any social problem, as history has demonstrated, does not respond well to knee-jerk-like laws that, instead of specifically identifying the cause, will cast a wide net. And this is what has happened in medicine, that the net has been cast over the entire speciality of pain management, with the result that doctors are now intimidated by regulatory agencies, and the treatment of pain has arguably regressed 25 years. Medicine and the human psyche constitute an infinitely complex organism with problems and solutions that are never clear-cut. The current, quote, epidemic of heroin abuse does, without question, require at the very least a proposed remedial strategy that will identify the actual individuals involved in the perpetration of these crimes. However, the extension of this network into the medical profession to label physicians drug pushers is ill-conceived and without question originated in the mind of an overzealous prosecutor who most likely had a family member fall prey to the disposition of addiction. I would imagine, as this has been the case throughout history, that the individual commenced a crusade against the pain medical profession without fully appreciating the decades-long work that had predated this civilized manner of treating chronic pain. Now, in 1993, there was a key paper that came out of Memorial Sloan Kettering. It was authored by Russell Portnoy and Kathleen Foley. And Sloan Kettering is a cancer hospital, and the work that Dr. Portnoy and Dr. Foley were involved in was focused on patients with terminal cancer pain. Their paper suggested that medications could be used in non-malignant chronic pain syndromes, which had a rational scientific basis to it. The problem, however, was that the pharmaceutical companies then jumped on this bandwagon and started to aggressively promote synthetic opiates in ways that they were not intended for. And unfortunately, doctors and for the medical profession in the US, in the pain management sector, got caught in the middle of this. So I go on to say in the article, instead, and all on the back of emotion and political rhetoric, regulations were passed whose intention was to intimidate doctors and pharmacies from dispensing these life-changing medicines. So what's happened is that people with chronic pain syndromes up until the early 1990s were really not being managed properly. People who had severe facial pain, back pain, pain related to post-surgical syndromes really did not have too many options. They were told to go home and deal with the pain. Understanding what pain was, what it did to people's lives, how it could be changed, started to come into the medical mainstream in the early 1990s. And the speciality of pain management began to develop. And today, the way that pain is treated is significantly different to the way it was treated back in the late 1980s or the early 1990s. I go on to say in the article, the immediate consequences of this rather draconian set of laws has been to grievously harm the patient population who have been left with inadequately treated pain. This form of cessation is, in my opinion, inhumane and should have been preceded by open forum discussions with concerned parties. This is part of the democratic process, and it seems it was utterly forgotten in this case. So the laws that have been passed both within various states, and particularly in New Jersey, which in my opinion have been completely counterproductive, came about really without a proper discussion with the parties involved. Understanding why doctors were dispensing medications, for what purposes, how they were intended to help patients with chronic pain. And again, I make this point, as I've done in other episodes of mine, that medicine in America seems to have been hijacked by lawyers and politicians who do not have the medical training and knowledge to pass laws and regulations. This should happen with groups that are led by physicians and not politicians. When one studies the long history of drug use and abuse, there is a cyclical element that depends sadly on the particular politicians calling the shots. These individuals see every opportunity as a means to further their political career and rarely give any credibility to the reasoned science and empirical evidence. And this is the problem, is the politicization of medicine. It becomes a political football. And there's nothing more important to a society than health, and obviously medicine and doctors are intimately related to that. So it's a sad indication of a society when politicians decide to jump on that bandwagon and use it for just advancement of their political career. I'm going to say America is a rather strange anomaly in the Western world with its convoluted and draconian laws regarding drug use and abuse. And again, this is another issue that's been reported widely in the press about the legalization of drugs. Now, medical marijuana is now legal, and marijuana is now legal in a number of states. So things are beginning to change, and I think that the quote, the war on drugs that occurred back in the 1970s and 1980s really did not do anything to eradicate the drug problem. In fact, it made it worse. And I'm going to say the billions spent by US governments on the quote, war on drugs was an utter failure, as is evident by the continued and often increased use of drugs. A large part of governmental policy stems from willful ignorance and, of course, a desire to fill state coffers. So, with a number of the policies that came out with the war on drugs and going after various drug groups around the world, a good part of it was economically based. It was, we're going to go after these drugs, and anybody who researches this issue will see that sometimes the lines between the cartels and the governments that were investigating or prosecuting them became very blurred. So I say the war on drugs has done neither and has in fact drained the capital reserves of the country with no realistic claim that any objective has been met. It can therefore be said that this, quote, war was one of insanity and most likely planned, comically, over a few whiskies around the White House dining table. Regardless, it was a social disaster and lessons were thankfully learned about the nature of drugs, man, and his desire to get high. So this shift that's happened in society and in societal attitudes towards the utilization of mind-altering substances has thankfully moved in the right direction. It's become more pragmatic. Alcohol is legal. It's a mind-altering substance, and there's no difference, some people would say, I agree, between alcohol and certain drugs. I mean, they both alter people's consciousness, and so individuals should be allowed to make that choice. And a safer, more pragmatic way of handling the utilization of drugs is to regulate it, to tax it, and to bring it into the same arena as was alcohol. And I'm sure people will know in the United States back in the 1930s, during Prohibition, people didn't stop drinking. I mean, all that happened was that there was a greater level of crime associated with procuring alcohol through illegal channels. And it was the same issue with drugs such as cocaine, heroin, marijuana. The current state of these affairs in New Jersey is pathetically like the ill-conceived advances on the cartels of Colombia and Mexico. But in this case, as in the two previously mentioned examples, there are innocent casualties who have been living with debilitating chronic pain for decades. So patients with chronic pain, for whatever reason, whether it's musculoskeletal, whether it's neurological, whether it's orthopedic, whatever the cause, whatever the syndrome, patients that live with chronic pain have the quality of their life significantly affected. And the management of this pain is an important part of, in my opinion, a humane society. So the laws that have been passed in New Jersey over the last several years have led to doctors now being petrified of dispensing these medications and patients now unable to get adequate treatment of their pain. So we're going to say that they've been living with debilitating chronic pain for decades, only to be recently told by their frightened doctors that they are no longer eligible for narcotic medications and will have to find pain relief elsewhere. The words on this paper, and the words that I'm speaking, can do absolutely no justice to the inhumanity of suddenly stopping the medications of an opiate-dependent patient. Now, people that have been on pain-relieving medications for a period of time develop naturally a certain degree of physical and psychological dependence, and there's nothing wrong with that because the benefits that incur to the patient with chronic pain outweigh the perceived disadvantages of dependence. And to suddenly stop medications for a patient who's been taking these for years is, again, I think, an inhumane act. So I'm going to say stopping the medications of an opiate-dependent patient for nothing more than the dictate of a bureaucrat with limited knowledge of the complex field of pain management is an inhumane act. To prevent this situation from escalating any further, it would behoove these patients to organize themselves into civil action groups and make their angry voices heard here in the state capital in Trenton. Because this is where these laws have been conceived, drafted, and legislated into the law books of New Jersey. And a large number of these laws came about under the guidance of Mr. Christie, who has been the governor since 2009 and has approximately 1 year left. And a lot of doctors feel that what he's done and what his administration have done is they've attacked physicians, which I've discussed is a fact, but more importantly, they've attacked patients chronic pain patients. They have cut off a very valuable therapeutic tool that helps patients with their chronic pain. They go and say this group of patients stands to suffer most from these crude, sweeping regulations. However, the other side of this coin is the increase in the use of street-grade heroin, which according to many reports has tripled over the last 3 years, with numerous deaths among the young and uninitiated. As the story goes, the children of parents with medications would steal them from their medication cabinets and proceed to distribute them among their friends at parties and social gatherings. This was the beginning of the end. Very shortly after this sojourn into synthetic opiates, these children, unable to afford these prescription medications, headed out to the street to obtain heroin. Now, this issue of heroin abuse is a real issue in New Jersey. And the reason, or one of the reasons that it has now gotten so much media attention is because it's a problem that has moved into the wealthy white suburbs. Heroin abuse and use and these drug problems have unfortunately been associated with a lot of the inner city African American ghettos, and the media and the politicians and the press didn't really feel it was appropriate, or didn't really feel it was politically expedient, I should say, to bring it to the attention of the public. However, with the problem moving into the wealthy white suburbs, it's now front page news on every media outlet in the state and across the country. Which also, I'm sure some people will listen to this and ask themselves the question, about the involvement of race in this issue. So this was the beginning of the end, and kids headed out to the streets to obtain heroin. The number of admissions to drug rehabilitation units has markedly increased, and the proliferation of these units has been expedited. So what's happened as a consequence of the heroin epidemic that's now going on is that the number of drug rehabilitation centers has tripled in the state of New Jersey. Now this is, again, it's another aspect of the healthcare system that in many ways is making it even more complex, because these rehabilitation centers are expensive and they're in it to make money. And anyone driving up and down the highways of New Jersey will see these billboards advertising these services everywhere. Now, admittedly, they are providing a service that is needed. However, the amount of money that these centers charge is prohibitive, and there really is only a small percentage of society that can afford to get rehabilitation services in these high-end rehabilitation centers. So this is a complex issue that requires obviously an increased amount of attention and therapy. It does not require, however, the tone of martial law. And the manner in which the US handles this social problem will reflect, or is a reflection, of its ability to act in a truly civilized manner. As I said at the beginning of this piece, the selective prosecution of doctors is wrong. There are, however, physicians who have been a part of this process, but the main cause, or the main source of these medications, are the pharmaceutical companies. And it makes complete sense that if these drug companies were stopped from manufacturing these medications and or aggressively promoting them, then it would be difficult or almost impossible for doctors to prescribe them. The one large pink elephant sitting in this opiate-filled room, however, is the 800-pound pharmaceutical company that has for decades gotten away with the indiscriminate dispensing of potent narcotics to doctors with expensive ads and slick presentations. One of the obvious questions is, why have these companies not been barred from their reckless advertising? And as I've talked about in other pieces, America is the only country in the world that allows pharmaceutical companies to openly advertise on TV and sell their drugs. I mean, this, in my opinion, is reckless, it's negligent, but it's also an indication of the broken political system, because these companies have very powerful and wealthy lobbies that go to Washington DC and will put money into the pockets of politicians to make sure that their business interests are protected. And I think that's wrong. So in my opinion, it is the vastly wealthy executives, and they make a lot of money, of these companies that should be held accountable for some of the current issues related to the heroin epidemic. And in my opinion, that would be American justice. I think that it's tragic whenever somebody passes away from a drug overdose. It's tragic for the family and the friends, and it's an awful thing. But finding a solution to the problem is not going to come about by selectively targeting physicians. The medical profession, as I talked about before, have the interests of their patients at heart. They are well-intended people that want to help. They have a patient that comes in to their office in chronic pain, and they have the interaction with the patient, and they want to mitigate the pain that the patient's feeling. The politicians in this country should sit down with the pharmaceutical executives and have these discussions. They should put aside the fact that they get significant donations from these companies and try and see the issue with a wider perspective, a wider social perspective. And I think that if the same approach as was used with the tobacco companies back in the 1980s is used with the pharmaceutical companies, I think that 5 years from now we'll see the opiate abuse and the opiate crisis, just as we saw with the tobacco crisis, disappear. I would like to thank you for watching 9, and good evening.